What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Modern video. And today, we're going to be taking a look at Goryo's Vengeance for the Modern format, and an early winner of the banned and restricted announcement that got rid of Violent Outburst, where we kind of expected maybe more of the, domain rhinos taking the top spot because it's kind of okay with playing at sorcery speed. Maybe we see something like Living End, which, it feels like it's a little bit more all-in, but still the power level is there. It just gives your opponent like an extra turn in a format where people really aren't playing Wraths to begin with. Maybe Yawgmoth would finally take to the top of the metagame as well, or maybe Titan would sneak in there. And none of that happened. We just have this very powerful reanimator / scam strategy that is just absolutely insane, and like the amount of consistency that this deck can produce and do the things that it's trying to do is pretty massive, and is definitely an early winner of the banning of Violent Outburst. Of course, before we get too deep in the video and I talk about the deck, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more content like this, a lot of Modern and Pioneer content and longer form videos get posted on my channel. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring the notification bell as we march on to 1K, and we're almost halfway there. And it's awesome. The support that I've gotten from the community has been amazing, and I'm very appreciative of it. And before we do get into the deck, in the description, you'll find a link to the deck list as well as a link to my Discord server as well. Please consider following that link over there to join the Discord server, come talk about Magic, all that fun, happy stuff. Now, let's go ahead and talk about this Goryo's Vengeance deck, because it is really sweet in what it's trying to do and how it's going about doing this. So for kind of like a little history lesson, Goryo's Vengeance decks have kind of existed in Modern in some capacity. We'd kind of seen these, like Through the Breach, like Goryo's Vengeance decks, where, if it had it in hand and it really didn't have like a good way of getting rid of it, it would just put it into play with something like a Through the Breach, which puts a creature into play, gives it haste, and then you sacrifice it. You get to attack with it and then put it in the graveyard, and then Goryo's Vengeance can go and get it back later. And in this deck list in particular, we have probably one of the best Reanimator targets in Magic right now that has been, I'm not going to say dominating Legacy, but definitely has been the preferred target of choice for a lot of Reanimator decks in Legacy. So to kind of go over plan A of this deck, we need to look at the namesake card, Goryo's Vengeance, which is 1 generic and 1 black for an instant. To return target legendary creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature gains haste. You exile it at the beginning of the next end step. It has Splice onto Arcane, but I'm pretty sure there's no Arcane spells in here, so that doesn't really come up. But really, the important thing is that you get to return a legendary creature, so it has that restriction. It's not any creature, it has to be legendary. It gains haste, and it actually gets exiled instead of getting sacrificed. So what exactly are we bringing back with Goryo's Vengeance? Well, this deck has 6 targets, which is 4 Atraxa Grand Unifier and 2 Gristlebrand. Gristlebrand used to be the card that people wanted to put into play with this. You would also see it in like the weird decks that would try to like cheat Gristlebrand into play on like turn 1 or turn 2, and then kind of go off and cast like Nourishing Shoals and things like that, and kill your opponent that way. But this list actually prefers to go with Atraxa Grand Unifier, which has Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, Lifelink as a 7/7, and when it enters the battlefield, you reveal the top 10 cards of your library, and for each card type, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards in your hand. You put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. So this card's going to typically draw probably about 3 to 4 cards. And the cards that you're going to end up drawing are pretty powerful. So it kind of sets up like the plan 1A of this deck. And you're able to, at times, get to cast Grief with Evoke. Stop me if you heard this before. And then you get to Ephemerate it. So essentially getting that kind of scam-esque gameplay where we would see them evoke a Grief and then play Not Dead After All, bring it back, and then gets you take another card out of your hand. This gets to do it. Obviously, at the cost of losing a point of power, which we can talk about how relevant it is, whatnot. But getting to double Thoughtseize your opponent essentially on turn 1 potentially with this deck, and still have kind of like this Reanimator plan as like a backup to it, or having this Reanimator plan and having a scam set up for it after, even on turn 3, is still very powerful. In can obviously just decimate your opponent after getting to draw, like I said, 3, 4, 5 cards with Atraxa Grand Unifier. This one in particular being kind of the go-to reanimator target over Gristlebrand for the fact that you don't need to activate Atraxa to get it. You just need to get it into play. So, I mean, between Gristlebrand and Atraxa, they both need to be in play to do their thing, and you just get to draw the cards, no life involved at all whatsoever. Where Gristlebrand, you need to pay the life up front to get it, and then, of course, you can swing and attack. You can get more raw cards with Gristlebrand, and even, like a lot of times, that is still very good. But Gristlebrand is not all that great with something like an Ephemera, and you might as well play the reanimator target that is going to benefit the most from Ephemera, because you're going to get to essentially look at 10 cards, put 3 or 4 in your hand, look at 10 cards, put 3 or 4 into your hand, and they're going to be cards that you get the decision, and it looks like a lot of Goryo's Vengeance players are prioritizing the decision of the cards that they get rather than like the number of raw cards, which I think is actually correct in more high-powered formats, because you're looking for very specific cards instead of just having the raw resources to kind of like grind your opponent out. This deck can just end games very quickly. Like I said, getting back in Atraxa on like turn 3 and then casting Ephemerate on it, looking at 10 cards, getting 4, looking at 10 cards, getting 4, having a 14-point life swing, that's huge, and just having, like the perfect hand to kind of like combat whatever your opponent might have going on. You'll be able to have like find force negations to be able to have free counter spells on your opponent's turn if they try to go play something like a Teferi Time Raveler, to try to like bounce or get rid of the Atraxa. You'll end up finding like Tainted Indulgences and Fateful Mendings, which can be played on turn 2 to get your Atraxa in the graveyard, or just played on future turns to get other Atraxas or Gristlebrands in the graveyard. So then you can just end up getting back a Gristlebrand and again hitting your opponent for 14 lifelink, and then Gristlebrand can start drawing just raw cards rather than getting Atraxa value that way. This deck does play a little bit of interaction in the terms of like Thoughtseize and Prismatic Ending. A secret mode of Thoughtseize is you can target a player, and while a lot of players I think that have played with Thoughtseize are just like, well, why would I ever target anybody that's not my opponent? Well, with Thoughtseize, you can technically get a turn 2 Goryo's Vengeance. If you Thoughtseize yourself, put an Atraxa or Gristlebrand into play, then you can just play a land untapped and then like Goryo's Vengeance back a Gristlebrand or Atraxa. While this line isn't, I wouldn't say necessarily all that great, unless you just have like a hand that's just full of stuff and you're just like, you pitch an Atraxa to it, then you can kind of end up drawing a bunch of cards, or like Gristlebrand to draw a bunch of cards, and then, just end up ditching, something like an Atraxa or another Gristlebrand into the graveyard, exiling the original creature, and then kind of setting up for another Goryo's Vengeance where you'll be able to ephemerate that creature and keep it into play. I'm sure there's like a few different lines that you could take, but Thoughtseize does kind of have this secret mode, like especially like in the late game as well, that you can just Thoughtseize yourself, show your opponent your hand of like a reanimator spell and a creature that you want to dump into the graveyard, dump the creature, play the reanimator spell, and it essentially just doesn't matter. You have some of the new lands in here, like Hedge Maze, which is the Surveil lands, along with Undercity Sewers, Shadowy Backstreet, and I think Meticulous Archive are all the Surveil lands where you can go fetch them, play tapped. You don't really have anything you want to do on turn 1. Ephemerate's just kind of like whatever, unless you're doing Grief shenanigans. Prismatic Ending you could play on turn 1, as well as like Thoughtseize, but a lot of like the plays and stuff end up going on, getting played on turn 2. So you'll see like the Archaeologist, which will mill 3 cards. You can get a non-creature, non-land, which means that you can get a lot of these other spells. And if you don't, it ends up being a 1/4. Blocks pretty well as like a 1/4 in the format, minus anybody that's still playing like kind of rhinos or anything like that. But like a lot of the other people that are playing creatures, the Archaeologist is going to block pretty well. Again, like something like a Tainted Indulgence, Faithful Mending having the ability to be flashback, so you're able to kind of like keep the cards going, hitting your land drops, and hopefully finding Goryo's Vengeances so you can get back Atraxas and being able to pitch Atraxas and Gristlebrands to these Faithful Mendings and Tainted Indulgences. In the sideboard, some of the interesting cards, we see Teferi Time Ravelers here, which are, very powerful, can be very good in a lot of situations where people are still playing these Cascade decks. Teferi is just going to stop that completely. Your opponent is still going to have to like choose to do things on their turn to Cascade rather than doing it on your turn. So Teferi Time Raveler is just going to be able to like, tick up, have some pretty cool synergies with Prismatic Ending and Thoughtseize to be able to cast those at instant speed. as well as being able to cast like Supreme Verdicts and stuff too when the situation asks for it. Celestial Purge is like an interesting option on the board, so you can hit Atraxas and Gristlebrand's with it. Also just having the flexibility of hitting red permanents as well as they come up. Surgical Extraction is just like free interaction for these graveyard decks to where you can just hit their Atraxa and then like their best target is just absolutely gone. Commandeer, I know that Rhino's decks were playing Commandeer, and I'm assuming it was like kind of take like their Crashing Footfalls and stuff. So I'd imagine that you could do that with Commandeer here. Tron is actually seeing an uptick in play too, so you could potentially take Karns. That'd be pretty sweet. And then finally, there's an Emrakul the Aeon's Torn on the sideboard. A lot of people have been playing Mill, so this is like a good Mill option. Also works very well with Goryo's Vengeance because Goryo's Vengeance is an instant. So you're able to kind of like on your opponent's end step, maybe you're able to, if you have 4 mana in play, Faithful Mending or Tainted Indulgence, ditch the Emrakul. With the Emrakul trigger on the stack to shuffle, you can Goryo's Vengeance it back and put it into play. Again, doing this on your opponent's end step. And because of how Goryo's Vengeance is worded, it is at the beginning of the next end step. So if you bring a creature back on an end step with Goryo's Vengeance, the next one, it'll actually get exiled. So then you're able to have this Emrakul into play and attack with it. And it's kind of a way that you can play around Force of Negation because you are doing it on your opponent's turn and able to keep the creature in play, which is really sweet. And yeah, that is the Goryo's Vengeance deck for Modern. Kind of mashing like 2 different strategies that people really don't like to play against. I think people like really like to complain about. The Goryo's Vengeance deck is super interesting because, again, we've seen variants like this before kind of pop up. You'd seen like Ilharg was like a creature that people were getting back because then they could attack and then put like an Emrakul or something like that into play and just lethal their opponent, which is like something Dom Harvey was doing like on the SCG tour years ago. But I think in like this meta game where people are still trying to figure things out and like speed is obviously the first thing people go to, getting to scam people on turn 1 essentially, and then getting to then for the future just get back, big 7/7s that can't really get unholy heated. We're looking at something like a Terminate to deal with it, and there's just people that aren't playing, those hard removal spells. It's a lot of damage base. It's a lot of, fatal pushes and things like that, which Atraxa and Gristlebrand dodge all of it. So really interesting to see how well this deck performs, and if anything happens to it. It's a deck that's kind of insulated pretty well against Graveyard Hate, so probably a pretty safe deck in the short term to pick up and play. If you have a lot of the pieces for it already, definitely feel free to play it because, the deck's really cool. It does a lot of powerful things, and that's what players like to do is powerful things. So that's going to do it in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below if there's any Modern decks that you want to see in the future or any videos in general. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. And, be sure to follow the links in the description as well. Join the Discord server. Look at the deck list if you're interested in playing it. And subscribe to the channel, as always. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will see you all in the next one.